Okay. Let me know when you're not busy with setting that up. Well, to be honest, I don't even know how to set up streams. I've been asked to do it for our show, and I've always shied away from it, mainly because I don't want to make it sort of a free-for-all, and I like to just kind of hang out, to be honest, with the people I enjoy talking to. Part of the reason I do this is I enjoy it, but it seems a little bit more level of responsibility when you have an audience that is live and you're supposed to attend to them, I suppose. But you tell me. I guess you've done this before. Oh, we all got to start somewhere. We have a YouTube channel, and it's no longer in existence. So even if it goes up, it might go down. If you know what I mean. Oh, that's been years at this point. Yeah. We've definitely been put on a few lists, and I'm sure most people in this thing have. I'm just so used to it at this point. It doesn't really bother me too much, fortunately. I mean, there's worse that can happen also, so knock on some wood. I can't see any wood, but you know, gotta be humble. Yeah. Some people go to jail or worse, so it depends. But I don't think that'll happen to you. That's a good analogy. I think that's apt. And by the way, I just sort of was spitballing in terms of what we might talk about. The only reason I said that was it was the first thing that came to my mind, given kind of what I saw as your background and what I was a little bit hesitant to dive into on.
It'll be fine.
Okay, good.
All right, guys, I'm Jim Dewey with Combating the Narrative, and joining me today is a very special guest, Adam Smith from the Myth of the 20th Century. So, for those of you who are unaware, well, why don't you introduce yourself, Adam, and give a little rundown on what it is you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, first of all, and hello to everyone who is listening and perhaps participating. I come from a show called Myth of the 20th Century. As the name might imply, we focus on 20th century topics, mainly history, but we've been doing this for six-ish plus years, and we've obviously had time to cover other areas of the universe. Lately, we've been doing a lot of stuff on kind of political economy. Originally, we were doing a lot of more historical, deep politics, but I have sort of an interest and somewhat of a background in engineering and economics, things like that, and so. Given a lot of the scrutiny that's been thrown at the dissident politics sphere, I've been shifting a little bit of our attention to things that are a little bit more economic and industrial in nature. So people might have noticed our shows shifting a little bit, but we have a few other people. I'm not the only one, and it's sort of a roundtable discussion. We have on guests, myth20c.com. If you're interested, I guess you'll make your determination at the end of the show. But we've had quite a few guests. Some of them are deceased, unfortunately, John McAfee included, to come and talk to us about what to make of this crazy world. Mainly, I would say what we're all united in is we don't really trust official media. We try to lend a skeptical eye to information that's out there. We try to arrive at some version of the truth. We certainly have our points of view, like everybody else, but really we're about truth seeking and having a good discussion.
And if those of you, or if you guys like what he's got to say, that his media is linked in the description. So after the stream, why don't you go ahead and check him out on BitChute, check out his website, his book, all that good stuff. So if you couldn't already tell by the thumbnail, what we're here to talk about today is really the phenomenon that I think culminated in the invasion of Ukraine not terribly long ago, but the decade and a half of marked decline in relations between Western, that is to say, NATO and really the United States and their vassals, and Eastern powers, so mostly Russia and China, but also to a lesser degree those in their sphere of influence and India as well. So I'm not sure entirely what your take on this is, Adam, but in the past, this dichotomy between East and West, this sort of clash of civilizations, clash of empires, was characterized and explained largely by stark differences in different systems of governance. So, obviously you've got your communism versus, for lack of a better term, capitalism here in the West, which was the primary driver of conflict between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. But in recent years, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this no longer entirely explains why things have gotten to the point where we're now engaged in a proxy war with the Russians in Ukraine over, a couple of strips of land. So, in an increasingly globalized economy wherein Western economies are becoming more reliant on the East, it's can you hear me, Adam?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay. I'm getting some dropped frames here. I apologize.
Oh no, no worries.
But as I was saying, to a lesser degree, can this be explained by differences in systems of governments and economics, because there's less of a difference these days. True, China is communist in name only, but they've got their own niche brand of capitalism that they're utilizing over there to great effect. And Russia is, again, no longer a communist nation. So, in my mind, the primary driver of this is the refusal of Western powers to, or Eastern powers to genuflect at the altar of Globo Homo. So, I feel that that's pretty well encapsulated by this New York Times article from 2013, where, they're talking about gays in Russia find no haven despite support from the West. So, our sort of, well, to back up, we sort of have to leave the broader question of who is pushing this and why for another platform. We're going to limit our discussion to sort of the policymakers and ideological adherents of, the West, broadly speaking, not necessarily the few people at the top really pulling the strings and driving the Globo Homo narrative for their own gain. But what's really pushing these two groups into conflict is the policy objective of the West to sort of open the ports, so to speak, of non-Western powers to Globo Homo, to things that are foreign to the constitution of these nations. So this is sort of reminiscent of the gunboat diplomacy of yesteryear. Now, what is gunboat diplomacy? Well, that was, I think, the two best examples of what gunboat diplomacy is the Opium Wars and really the forcing open of Japan by Commodore Perry. Really, Western powers sailed into the ports of, nations who prior to that point had refused to engage in trade with them, and under threat of force open trade. In the case of the Opium Wars, forced the trade of opium. In the case of Japan, really just opened up the Japanese market to the West. So, and why does Globo Homo feel the need to evangelize in the way they do? Okay, the audio's good now. And feel free to jump in at any time, Adam, too. I don't want to necessarily monopolize all the time, but...
Well, I'll try to say a couple things. I think this past year was a big year for everyone. I think we're all trying to decipher really what it means, I think, for our countries respectively and where we're all headed. I think to try to summarize it a little bit, I would characterize what we're seeing as generally a deglobalization trend that is a bit of a reversal of what we saw over the past 30 plus years after the end of the Cold War. And I think we might be looking at a second variant of the Cold War going forward. I think it's interesting to discuss what are the motivations behind that. If we agree that that's what's happening, who are the players who are best poised to benefit from it, and what do the little people do as a response to the mega trends that I think are going to unfold. But I think it was definitely a pivotal what happened in February 2022 for sure. And I think it was not really a huge shock to some people who were following it more closely, but I think it shocked most people. And I think a lot of people are having to readjust. And that's coming off of a very rough period after this global shutdown from the so-called pandemic as well. So we've had quite a few years to really transition, and I think they're actually somewhat related. But we can perhaps get into that more.
And I think that's an important observation to touch on is, again, the decoupling of, or the deglobalization of the powers that be. In particular, the Chinese are attempting to implement what they have dubbed their Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive infrastructure project, initiated in 2013 that is, for all intents and purposes, a sort of neo-colonialism where they're establishing all sorts of foreign economic bases, extracting raw materials and resources for their own gain back home, and in return they're building up a bunch of infrastructure in places that were previously colonized by the West but have been vacated after the end of the Second World War. And though this has been going on for some time now, to bring up COVID is, again, another good point, because that was really the point where the West and the East were forced to decouple because of what was going on with COVID and the ports getting shut down and all that stuff. It's wreaked havoc on both Eastern and Western supply infrastructure that we still haven't recovered from to this day. Now, to understand another piece of what's driving this dichotomy between East and West is the East in particular faces a crisis of legitimacy in terms of their government. So when governments globalize, when we start importing hordes and hordes of people who are not like us, they don't share a sense of extended kinship with us, they don't value the same things we do, it creates, disparate and warring groups of increasing degrees of power within, in particular in the United States, but in the West broadly. Opium wars were about free trade too, says Victor Saxon. Yeah, that is a fair point to bring up. The Dr. Arasov says, thoughts on the Russian Federation. Are they, in our opinion, based, cringed, or something in between? We'll touch on that later, and I don't want to lose sight of the point I'm on, but suffice to say that it's important to have entities out there that serve as a counterbalance or a roadblock in the way of the West, broadly speaking. But if you think that the likes of, the Russian Federation or the Chinese are on our side, the dissident right here in the West, you're wrong. One of the biggest things the Russian media was talking about during the opening days of the invasion of Ukraine was the denazification of Ukraine, and that's similar rhetoric to what's coming out of the Western media sources as well in terms of dealing with stuff domestically, which again we're not going to touch on too much today, just because it's a sensitive topic for YouTube, and I've covered it at length. But as these ruling groups sort of the thing you have to understand about the elite too is that they care solely about being the elite. They care about being in the establishment and retaining power. They don't give a damn about people like you and I. And their policy objectives are not aimed at the betterment of the United States as a whole, or the uplifting of the American worker or anything like that. It's really just to retain power. And they've been insulated for so long from the consequences of their failure to represent the people that comprise the United States. If they lose a war, well, it wasn't an existential war. We fought anyway, and it's the government who sustained a bunch of debt, not the people who sort of initiated those wars. They, in fact, enriched themselves off of it. If we import a bunch of third world migrants here into the United States, and crime goes up, and all the social ills that come with taking people who have ruined their own countries and importing them here. These people live in gated communities with private security. They don't suffer the ill effects of, again, the consequences of their actions. They're never in danger of losing their station. They make damn sure of that. And so as these governments fail to represent the people here in the U.S., we're seeing a phenomenon that first started in the guerrilla wars the United States has fought in the latter years rather of the 20th century into the early 21st century, where we're no longer fighting some sort of unified state, right? The primary allegiance of the people has shifted from the state over to something else entirely. Now, in the West in particular, it's usually race, white versus people of color, or whatever the term du jour is. In the Middle East, it happened to be more of a religious nature. In places like Vietnam and Korea, that reassignment of your primary allegiance away from the state was reassigned to a political ideology or an economic ideology. insofar as communism is concerned. So, um, in order, because we're suffering the effects, or the elite are suffering the effects of no longer having the backing of the little people, things are getting bad here in the West. There's a lot of domestic strife, a lot of racial conflict that sort of serves to destabilize the powers that be. And so, in part, right, they need to create a boogeyman in order to refocus some of the internal strife outwardly, and achieve a degree of unity until really the demographic replacement that will again gain the support of the people is complete. So that's one piece of it. We need a boogeyman in order to keep the elites in control of the United States and the West. But you also have to understand too that China and Russia are a little more grug-brained, as it were, than the United States. So they stand in direct opposition to some of the things that the powers that be push, like gay marriage. If you look at the human rights pages on both China and Russia, I mean, some of the primary charges leveled at the Chinese and the Russians are things that 50 years ago would have been seen as normal here in the United States. So again, not to hammer down on the whole gay marriage thing, but that would be an example of it. Talking about ethnic minorities not being given franchise in those nations that would have been considered normal. They call it abusive psychiatry, but they're a little more hardcore on their they're a little more quick to label things as psychiatric disorders, like the West was in the past. Capital punishment. So these are all the allegations that are getting leveled at these Eastern powers, and it's one of the things that's sort of the call to arms for the more causey, more crusader types here domestically. Live in the pod,
Well,
eat the bugs, take the jabs.
let me ask you, Jim, if I may. How long have you been aware of, let's just call it the dissident politic space? Just so I can ask a few more questions to follow up. I want to understand your background.
So my background, I guess 2015, 2016 is when I would have started to really stray far from my boomer con neoconservative roots, right? For those of you who don't know, I talked about this on stream maybe a month or two ago, but I was aware of how bad things were getting, but I still thought that there was some ability to salvage the United States, and there were some institutions that had not been subverted. So I used to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, and seeing the rot that had spread there really hammered home how bad things have gotten.
Okay.
So that would have been about, call it 2019-ish, would have been really getting black-pilled.
Sure. And I guess you were alluding to a lot of, I guess, similar people's affection for some of these foreign powers as it pertains to people like us in America. And I think many of us share that. But if I'm hearing you right, I want to make sure I understand this. You're saying that may not necessarily get us anywhere because these foreign powers don't really have any affection for us. Did I follow that much so far correctly?
Correct, yeah. And that's one of the things, that was sort of the tail end of the point I was making, is that the Russians and the Chinese, and to a lesser extent, again, the Indians as they're up and coming, don't really suffer the same shift of the primary allegiance away from the state, because those states represent, by and large, the best interests And broadly speaking, obviously there are some abuses here and there, but broadly speaking, they're out to represent the best interests of the people who they govern, and they are a little more reflexive to the wills of their ethnic majorities. So, though the Chinese may be oppressive towards Tibetans, they represent the interests of the Han Chinese in China. Though the Russians may be a little rough in their treatment of Ukrainians, with whom they're currently engaged in a war. They're out for the best interests of the Russian-speaking people, both in the Russian Federation and in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea.
Let me ask you another hypothetical question then. If there were to be a warmer or hot war following up from our sort of proxy war conflicts over the past 70 plus years during the first Cold War, would you think people like us would benefit by seeing the U.S. defense apparatus being dismantled by some of these foreign powers, or would we be better off supporting our,
well,
I'm not going to say country, but let's just say our military in that conflict, and then
zone within which we reside.
Well, yeah, and then in the aftermath, what would be the best thing to do, and who would win? I mean, a lot of these are unknown, but
so
again, hypothetically, what would you like to see, and what is your highest probability on the different scenarios? Or what are your probabilities in the different scenarios? Whether the West wins, the West loses. It's sort of a long, drawn-out conflict. There's many hypotheticals, but where do you see people like us benefiting, and then also on the other side losing?
Well, I mean, I think that's all predicated on how the next 5 years go for the dissident right. I'm a big proponent, legitimately, not even as like a, all my posts are satire, don't take them seriously, federal government. I'm truly against any sort of violent action. I just don't think it's pragmatic. So, if a hot war were to kick off between the United States and some sort of foreign entity like the Chinese, like the Russians, you may see a much larger interest from the Chinese governments and the Russian government in supporting some sort of, or fomenting some sort of insurrection here in the United States. And to a degree, I do believe that some of the political discourse here in the United States on both sides is funded in part by Chinese organizations and Russian organizations with a vested interest in destabilizing the United States domestically in order to take advantage of the situation abroad. I think it's incredibly unlikely that a hot war will ever occur between the United States and China, between the United States and Russia, because it really doesn't stand to benefit the ruling class, the powers that be, the elites, because they're not going to want to put themselves in a position where they stand to potentially lose their positions of power and all the trappings that come along with it. So it's one thing to go and embark on some sort of military expedition in Iraq for 20 years. It's quite another to throw rocks at a hornet's nest and initiate what may be an existential crisis for powers in the United States. Conventionally, the Chinese at this juncture lack the ability to project force into the United States conventionally, but a nuclear exchange certainly would wreck things for the ruling class. So I think that the West is going to push the envelope as far as they can without actually engaging in a hot conflict with a foreign power, because that's just not in their best interest. So yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the calculus behind depleting our military stockpiles. I know the Defense Department has been screaming about we're
stockpiles of what specifically? I'm just not aware of what you're referring to, but are you talking about literally bullets or equipment, men, the training? What do you mean by stockpiles?
So in particular, there have been news articles published with respect to Javelin anti-tank missiles. We've pretty much given the Ukrainians all we can afford to give.
I heard those were somewhat outdated compared to the latest stuff. I'm not sure if that's correct.
Well, it's currently in frontline service. It all depends on how your
Right,
unit
but
actually will be fought.
what is the? I mean, I don't know if that's Army, Navy, Marine Corps, but whoever is in possession of those in the United States military, what do they have? That's at or better than that. I mean, I'm assuming that's not the cutting edge.
No,
I'm
that
not
I
sure
mean
though.
javelins are the bleeding edge of what the United States has currently in service. What that is an anti-tank missile
Mm,
that
okay.
the United States Army and the United States Marine
Was it
Corps.
the Patriots that were considered a little bit older? I'm not sure. So
Yeah, so
somebody
that's
said
something
somewhere
different. A
that
Patriot is a missile
I
defense
say,
system, similar to Iron Dome. Uh,
uh-huh.
real effective against things
Israelis,
like
yeah,
Scuds and
right,
other sorts of indirect fires. So we've
gotcha.
suffice to say, without going into the nitty gritty of what equipment we're now lacking, um, we have put ourselves at a strategic disadvantage because if a hot war were to kick off, we can't just readily replace those stockpiles. It's not just as simple as flipping a switch and turning the production line back on. For case in point, the United States is incapable of making more F-22s because the production lines have been shut down. That was part of the reason there was a shift towards the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter program. So, and part of the
Wait, so the
calculus.
reason the F-35 was made was to shut down the F-22? Is that what you mean?
In part, so it was a shift in tactics. Again, the F-22 was designed towards the tail end of the Soviet Union's prominence. So in the late 80s is when they started at the drawing board with the F-22, and that was meant to be an
Mm.
air superiority fighter. Um, we've since moved away from having massive fleets of air superiority fighters that are cutting edge. Our fleet of F-15s and F-16s do just fine because the United States and Chinese don't have much in the way of an air force to begin with. So but again, part of the reason we moved towards the Joint Strike Fighter program, strike fighter as in close air support and air superiority, a multi-role fighter, was in part because it is just too difficult to turn the production lines back on at Lockheed Martin to start producing F-22s. It would be cost prohibitive. A lot of the equipment probably no longer exists, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the calculus behind depleting our stockpiles in the way that they've been depleted is I think that the elites are keenly aware that they're unwilling to engage in a conventional conflict with Eastern powers, in part because, again, it puts them at risk of an existential crisis. And, the people of the United States at this point in time have no stomach for war. I think the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are case in point. Really, our casualty numbers were very, very small compared to what a conventional war would be, and the American public just was not here for it. The majority of the time the United States spent engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, people were agitating to end the war. So they wouldn't have enough support at home. It'd be tremendously expensive, and I know that the United States is, and I guess the West in general, has gotten away from the gold or silver standard, and it's all just fiat currency. So our money's fake anyway. The debt doesn't really matter to the elites, but at a certain point, hyperinflation becomes a problem for even the elites. So unless they absolutely got backed into a corner, the United States isn't interested. And same goes for the Chinese and the Russians. I think we've seen what a paper tiger the Russians have been, without getting into the nitty gritty of.
I agree with you, but my general read on the sort of, and I don't really read too much of the material that I used to, by the way, but my general read on the dissident opinion about Russia is that they seem to be a little bit more optimistic about their prospects. And I don't share that with them. I agree with you. I think the Russians are in a very bad state, not only militarily, but economically going forward.
Right.
Demographically, it's probably the worst long-term trend they
Well,
have. But
and I
there's a
don't.
lot to say that is unfortunately bad about
It's
their position
so
for them.
it's so hard to parse what exactly is going on in Ukraine because the propaganda machine is working full time. If you check my Twitter,
Completely agree.
I won't pull it
Completely
up
agree.
right now, but the Kiev Times or the Kiev Daily Mail or whatever it is, the Kiev newspaper is claiming that the Ukrainian army has destroyed more tanks than the Russian Federation ever possessed, both in active service and reserve. There's probably some Russian general somewhere wishing he had that amount of equipment to lose. you know, to
Yeah,
lose
you
that.
can't destroy more than what the other guy has to begin with, right?
So
That's not mathematically possible.
the idea that Russians are just getting sent into a meat grinder and they've sustained like 100,000 casualties is asinine to me. But ultimately, I think that they
Well, I mean, they withdrew
underestimated.
from their advances. I think that's pretty indisputable. I don't really consider
Right,
that
right,
something
and
we can ascribe to propaganda. So
no, and
I don't think they're
fundamentally,
they're winning on that front.
the war is still going on nigh on a year later at this point, and that was clearly there
Hmm.
was nobody in the Kremlin who was like, "Yep, this is exactly the
No,
plan. We want to be embroiled in this conflict for years
right.
and years and years." They still retain a good chunk of the territory that they set out to occupy, but suffice to say, I thought the Russians would perform a lot better than they actually did. The Chinese are in a much
What do
better.
you think they didn't do as well? And just to not to deflect from the Chinese, I want to get to them, but on the topic of why the Russians did not perform as well, in your military experience and analysis, why do you think they haven't performed as well?
Well, a big piece of it is logistics. So you have to understand that there was a big difference in how the West practices logistics and how the Soviet Union and their successor states practiced logistics. So the United States and NATO in general practices what we call pull logistics. So you radio up
Hmm.
to, higher headquarters with the things you want, you need, and you will request things be sent to you.
Hmm.
The Soviet Union was operating under the assumption that in very short order, if they came into conflict with the West, as masses of Soviet armor are pulling through the Fulda Gap into Germany, um, nuclear there would be a nuclear exchange of some sort, and they would be operating in an environment where comms are knocked out, and there's a lot of confusion going on, and you still need to supply your troops. So they have what's called push logistics. So instead of requesting specifically what you need and getting it, you are supplied with what higher headquarters thinks you need. So that
Yeah, it's very centrally planned.
exactly, and that's what it boils down to is the central planning of the Soviet state bled over into military strategy. I mean, they
Yeah.
have just been suffering economically. They've got a GDP that's comparable to that of Italy. So
Right.
they're not exactly flush with cash with which to, really fund and train their troops. They're utilizing mostly conscripts. Their equipment again is aging. They do have some cutting edge, bleeding edge technology, but it's not present in any significant numbers. So even though they've got the T90 tanks and the T14 tanks, they're still heavily reliant on T62 or T62s, T70s, T80s. These older legacy pieces of equipment, which would have been fine if the Ukrainians weren't supplied to the degree that they were supplied by the West. So, the Ukrainians were in possession of very similar equipment to the Russian Federation at the outset of the war. I think that the people in the Kremlin, not just Vladimir Putin, had assumed that the West would respond in the same way that they responded to the invasion of Georgia, what was going on in Chechnya, what was going on in Crimea in 2014, where, okay, we'll slap you with even more sanctions. Well, at this point, what's the point of more sanctions? You know what I mean? Like they've already been punished so hard for so long that their economy has found workarounds. So
Okay, so the missing assumption in your original analysis, and not to say that this was bad analysis, like a lot of people were not sure what was going to happen, but just to clarify, the missing piece that you did not know, and doesn't sound like the Kremlin knew either, was that Ukraine would be supplied by the West. And that, plus what Ukraine had against Russia, was too much for the Russians to take Ukraine. Is that roughly correct?
That's the gist of it.
Okay, got it.
As for why, the West has decided to back Ukraine so hard to the tune of like $100 billion at this point, is I could offer up a lot of conjecture. Is it the super secret viral labs that existed in Ukraine, according to the Kremlin? I genuinely don't know.
I don't know. That's just propaganda, probably. But
do they want to deflect away from, internal strife potentially? Are there really some people who believe that this is the thin end of the wedge, and you got some real hawkish neocons in there advising the powers that be, saying if we continue to retreat, continue to back, continue to accommodate, there's not going to be any choice between peace and war, only war and surrender. Potentially, I don't know. A lot of the information that would be required to make that sort of analysis is not open source, as they say.
Of the 200 billion, I don't follow this as closely as you do. Do you know the percentage of that comes to the United States versus the Europeans versus whoever else is donating?
Off the top of my head, no. The last number I heard, and I don't follow this too terribly closely either, because it's been kabuki theater in terms of the propaganda machine from both sides. It's so hard to parse fact from fiction. You'll almost have to piece that together after it's all said and done. So, but I know the lion's share of it is coming from the United States in terms of money and equipment. The United States, in terms of the
cost, though, I would say the Europeans are bearing some of that because of their energy shortages, and then also the benefits are going to the United States because the Texans are selling the Germans a lot of gas right now.
That might have factored into the calculus too, as
there
might have been people in the Kremlin who are thinking there's no way that these people in NATO are so insane that they jeopardize the supply of natural gas to Western Europe, when winter time is approaching, and they went ahead and did it. So,
well, what are you talking about? Nord Stream 1, or I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, at any point in time, the Russians can turn off the natural gas pipeline flowing from Russia to Western Europe. I'm not talking about that in particular, but that's another piece of the puzzle. I don't necessarily care to talk too much about the destroyed pipeline because, again, it's so unclear what actually happened.
Yeah, it's speculative as to who's responsible for sure.
So, but
unless you actually know, which I'm sure some people do.
Point being, that could have factored into the decision to invade, to cross the border into Ukrainian territory was, well, they're not going to push back too hard because we've got them by the balls in terms of raw resources, natural gas, things like that. So, but you have to understand too what the strategic objectives are of these near peer adversaries, as they say, right? So at this point in time, it would be part of the brilliance of the Chinese and part of the brilliance of the Russians is that, they've played a bad hand well. They have been on the back pedal since Russia since the end of World War II, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, rather. And currently they're not in a point in time where they can seriously challenge the United States globally. So their strategic objectives at this point have been, in effect, to get NATO the hell off their front door. And China's in a very similar situation where, they're not at this point in time seriously considering trying to build a fleet large enough to go toe-to-toe with the entirety of the United States Navy in both the Atlantic and Pacific. That would be silly. They know that they don't have the logistical capacity to try and stage some sort of invasion of the United States mainland or Hawaii or anything like that. What they're
Oh
trying
no,
to
that's not
do,
going to happen. No.
no, no. What they're trying to do is deny the United States command of commons or access to these regions. They're trying to push them off of their doorstep. And so you have to figure that into the calculation. There are people.
What regions are you talking? Are you talking about their
Um,
geographic locale, like Southeast Asia? Are you talking about the Middle East? You're talking about Central Asia? What regions are you
so
talking about?
Southeast Asia, in particular, with respect to China. So the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, their man-made islands that they're building. They
Right.
call it the 9-dash line there in the South China Sea, is the immediate policy objective for the Chinese. And it's in that light that we have
Right.
to,
Right.
you know, critically analyze what the Chinese are doing here. Um, Again, if you think that they're trying to go toe to toe with the entirety of the United States Navy, you're silly. But what they do want to do, and what they're seriously trying to do, is build a fleet large enough to go toe to toe with the U.S. 7th Fleet, the fleet responsible for that region, should they need to, should they decide to invade Taiwan, should they decide to really press the issue with some disputed territory in that region. And again, Russia is in a similar boat. They don't have much in the way of sea access, but that again factored into the equation in invading those portions of Ukraine, in particular Crimea, as access to the Black Sea. They're also trying to reassert control over former Soviet states. So again, Moldova is another big one. Victor Saxon says, "Oh, that's not in relation to us. So we're just gonna keep on keeping on." But it's in that prism that we have to view it, and you have to understand too that logistics are the primary driver of any sort of potential conflict. And while the United States, on paper, does massively outnumber the Chinese Navy in terms of raw tonnage, they're scattered all throughout the globe, and we have multiple different military obligations that we need to uphold that would preclude us from pulling all resources available and taking it to the South China Sea, and we wouldn't be able to do it in a timely manner anyway. And the same calculus factors into some sort of conflict, whether it be on land in Asia or Southeast Asia, rather, China in particular, or with the Russians in Syria, in Iran, in Ukraine. The United States takes an awful long time to mobilize. You have to understand that we have 70-ton tanks. We have a huge territory here in North America where even our equipment that's in reserve would have to be transported by rail to a shipyard and then cross a contested ocean, and then be offloaded piecemeal. We do have some air assets,
If I
but
recall correctly, during the first Gulf War, it took about a month to get all that stuff over there.
there
Is
was
that
a
about
huge
right? Would
buildup.
you say?
There was a
Yeah.
huge buildup along the Kuwaiti border. And that
Operation Desert Shield was like the first part of the Desert Storm where they were moving everything.
and
Is that
yeah,
right?
and if you want to, read into this a little more, up until just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States Army every year would hold an exercise called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany, where they would practice mobilizing for that war, because that was going to be the kicker. And that was, where you take a look and you wonder why Western powers were doing what they were doing, setting up defense in depth in and around Germany through the Fulda Gap, where we're not setting ourselves up to launch an offensive into Russian territory at the outset of war. We're trying to delay. We've developed things like nuclear landmines, a bunch of tactical nuclear weapons. This is where we start to develop air assets that were intended specifically to shred Soviet armored columns. So your Apache attack helicopters, your A-10 Warthog. The idea is there's probably only going to be one big battle, and if we lose it, there's no way that we're going to be able to D-Day our way into Europe again. And it's going to take 6 weeks probably for the United States to mobilize in earnest. And that's where we see the mission set of the Marine Corps as well. They're there to establish a beachhead they're attached to the Navy for a reason. They're going to establish a beachhead and hold it long enough for the United States Army to arrive. So,
Interesting.
suffice to say that any conventional conflict, even without throwing nuclear arms into the mix, is just so tremendously difficult and expensive and just doesn't really benefit the powers on either side. All we're really going to see in at least the near future, probably as long as I'm alive, as long as nothing really changes here, is saber rattling. So as far as
So you think the prospects of a hot war are low?
very low, very low.
Interesting.
I think you're much more likely, and I still think this is unlikely in and of itself, but you're much more likely to see some sort of IRA type insurrection here in the United States rather than, which I think is a bad idea, by the way, but that would be far more likely than anything going hot with the Russians or the Chinese.
Well, in terms of the timing of that, and again, I know you're not promoting this, but what do you think the circumstances would need to be for something like that to be more likely than not?
In terms of domestic conflict or a
Well,
hot
I'm not sure what you mean by IRA. I mean, IRA, the situation was there was sort of a long-standing historical grievance between two ethnic groups, ethno-religious groups, I guess you could include, and that period kicked off. I'm rusty on exactly when it started, but it obviously came to a semi-close in the 90s, but it was going on for probably 100 years, arguably. And it was low level, then it got worse, and then it died back. But there were circumstances. It seemed like the breakup of the British Empire probably was a catalyst there. I guess what catalyst would you say would kick off something like that in the United States? And like, who are the players involved?
I'm not sure how much of my content, if any, you've watched, but I do touch on this quite a bit in some of my videos where one of the chief issues I have with the conservative movement and the dissident right as well, they're not exempt from this, is they're completely unwilling to do anything that would make them uncomfortable. They're completely unwilling to take a stand and potentially face social ostracism. They continue to acquiesce. They've managed to conserve nothing because they're weak. The calories keep flowing. They've got their bread and circuses. So if there was a red line in the sand, I can't imagine what it would be, because a lot of the things that in, days of yore, not even all that long ago, that would have been called a line in the sand, if the government does this, I'm going to start shooting, have been crossed. And I think a lot of that happened during COVID, where we all, or the conservatives, generally speaking, just sort of allowed that to happen. So I'm not sure what it would take. It would be difficult to say, but suppose something did kick off, you're really looking at an uphill battle. A lot of people like to try and point at things like, oh, the United States lost the Vietnam War, or the United States lost Iraq and Afghanistan, or look how hard the French got their asses kicked in Algeria, this, that, and the other thing. Guerrillas always come out on top. And that's true to a degree, but you're lacking a lot of context, right? So first and foremost, you have to understand that in a lot of these conflicts, there were instances or certain areas of operation in which the casualty ratio between the imperial power and the guerrilla force was 100 to 1, not in the favor of, the guerrillas. So you have to be willing to die en masse because, much like the Reddit volunteer brigade was finding out rather rapidly at the outset of the war in Ukraine, is radio direction finding and indirect fire is a bitch. Like, you are up against a huge technological disadvantage, and it doesn't necessarily militate your ability to come out on top, but it severely hampers it, and you have to pretty much realize that you're a dead man if you're going to pick up arms in that way.
Yeah, I think the asymmetry between the professional military services and the Second Amendment right bearer has only increased over time. I do not think the advantage is to the little man today,
Well, and
as opposed to during the Revolutionary War.
you have to understand too that during the Revolutionary War, the militias that were formed were similarly armed to the British Army. Were they as well equipped?
Right.
No, but
Exactly. That's
pretty
my
damn
point.
close. There were
Yeah.
civilian cannon owners. You know what I mean? Like they had literal field artillery, and this is in part due to generations past who refused to challenge these pieces of legislation aimed at hamstringing the ability of any sort of guerrilla movement to stand toe to toe with a conventional force. You know, things like the passage of the National Firearms Acts or the Hughes Amendment that have really taken destructive devices out of the hands of the populace, taken fully automatic firearms out of the hands of the populace. And that's to say nothing of the surveillance infrastructure. But one thing people also don't consider when they're taking a look at how hard the United States got its ass beat by people, wearing bathrobes and flip flops, wielding rusty AKs, at least in terms of achieving their strategic objectives, is there was like no infrastructure in these places that they went to invade at the time of their invasion. You know, so there was a lot of opportunity for these guerrillas to hide. Whereas here in the United States, we've got an advanced surveillance infrastructure. One of the things that was really shocking to me, even me, was during the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, and granted, there were riots going on at the time, but the FBI had infrared surveillance footage of the whole event from a drone. So that just really gave me insight into the degree to which they can observe comings and goings here in the United States. It would be virtually impossible to organize in any sort of way and not face any sort of infiltration, which would, of course, spell, death for any sort of guerrilla.
Well, yeah, most of us know each other through the internet, and that's pretty easy to shut off.
Well,
So,
and then there's always
how
the
do you organize then?
exactly, and that's why too I encourage people to, in their attempt to sort of form parallel societies, do focus on not just owning a bunch of guns, but owning things that would decouple you from modern infrastructure. So how are you going to communicate if they shut off cell service, if they shut off, the internet, if they shut off even hard telephone lines? Well, ham radios is a very good thing to get into. But that's a little bit of a digression. You have to understand that the reason the guerrillas won isn't because they, had some sort of special military prowess that completely rendered obsolete the, military might of modern Western powers. These Western powers chose to up and leave because it got really expensive. That's what it boils down to. If they were so inclined, they could have just, initiated a genocide in those regions and probably put any sort of insurrection to a stop through some sort of ethnic cleansing. And when you have to consider that those, to touch on what we said earlier, those conflicts weren't existential crises for the powers that be. There was never any danger that the North Vietnamese army was going to find its way onto American shores. There was never any danger that Al Qaeda was going to be able to operate with impunity in the United States, not to any substantive degree. But when you start to form guerrilla movements in the United States that have the backing of the people, or at least a large subset of the people, you've now posed an existential threat to the establishment, and they're going to eliminate that threat by any means necessary. So you'd see them getting real goofy real fast. And, you would, if you think we're being portrayed as the bad guys now, where if you don't think that grown men dressed in dresses strip dancing in front of kids is okay, then you're a domestic terrorist. You think that's bad? Imagine what would happen if some sort of shooting started. Like, the propaganda machine would be working overtime, and fundamentally, we don't control those novel battle spaces. Not really. I mean, what do people like you and I have? We've got 4chan, we've got BitChute, but we don't have the eyes and ears of the people in the same way that um, the establishment does. They can push messaging out on conventional media platforms. They can push messaging out on social media platforms. TikTok, in particular, is one that I've seen that has warped the minds of Gen Z, like, really hard. And even if they need to do
I
something
don't know if
that's
you've heard this, by the way, about TikTok. I heard it. Some little bird landed on my shoulder and whispered it, I think. But there are types of content on TikTok that are banned in China that are actually encouraged algorithmically in the United States. And I think you can guess what types are banned in China and what is encouraged in the United States. And TikTok is a Chinese social media app.
right,
So
right,
just keep
and
that all in mind.
that's where I said earlier too. Like, part of the aim of part of what China is doing, part of what Russia is doing, is trying to destabilize the United States domestically, and that's a big part of it. And
Yeah,
they
not to be fair, but just to be sort of like a factual, the United States does the same thing to both of those countries, as far as I could tell. We just don't really brag about it in our media, but I think
well,
there's certainly a lot of operations that go on in Hong Kong, that go on in places like Kyiv and Ukraine, that have been touched upon by our intelligence agencies for sure. And our
right.
social media presence globally is really a big portal for U.S. intelligence agencies to manipulate foreign countries as well. It goes both ways. Every foreign country does this to each other to different degrees. Really, what it comes down to is how powerful are the different arms of these uh, attempts, and some countries are better at it than others. And I think actually the United States is pretty good at it, um, at least from their point of view, like the sort of powers that be.
Oh
Maybe
yeah,
not us, but
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that it's no coincidence that as soon as a hot war kicks off in Ukraine, all of a sudden Ukraine is you know forwarding legislation to legalize gay marriage and shutting down the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That stuff
yeah,
is
right.
it's 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 done for a reason. And again, that stems from a critical difference between these two competing powers. Is, at least on some level, the Chinese and the Russians, they want what is best for the ethnic majorities in their nation because they want to build a strong nation from the ground up. Whereas a lot of the elites in the West are foreign to those nations, in a sense, at least ethnically speaking. And the way they've been able to grab and maintain power is by subversion of traditional Western values and subversion of a lot of the institutions of these Western nations. Victor Saxon says, do either of you think that Russia is going to make any more territorial land grabs throughout this war, or is it going to be like the Korean War, where things just become a stalemate? I'll let you answer that first, since I've been talking for a while here.
Just full disclosure, I'm not a military expert. I predominantly have more expertise, I would say, in economics than anything else.
Right.
But when it comes to what I've been noticing, just looking at lines on a map, I don't think Russia is really going to be able to do much more than it already has. If they try, they better get some help. I mean, Belarus was involved for a little bit there, and I think they sort of quickly retreated because I think that was really just a surprise attack to distract people. I don't think they have any sustaining power. I really think that unless the Chinese start backing up the Russians, which has a huge, broad implication for them as well, which I kind of think because of that, they're not going to help them. I think Russia's kind of stuck right now. That's just my read on it, though.
Yeah, that's about where I'm at with it too. I mean, if we follow my line of thinking that this whole thing was really a miscalculation by the Kremlin, who did not imagine that they would, you know, get fought this hard in achieving their operational and strategic goals, it's probably going to be some sort of a stalemate. If they were to try and push any further, even if they had the ability, you're looking at potentially involving other players in Ukraine against. they would need the backing of the Chinese, and it would really escalate things beyond what either party wants. As far as Finn Wraith says, do you think China will invade Taiwan? I think that the answer to that is all predicated on how this whole Ukraine thing plays out. If it ends up being that after the dust settles, the Russian Federation still remains in control of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, I think it's likelier than not that they would try and do something similar. But if it is that the Russians don't come out on top, they'll continue to bide their time, because ultimately they stand to gain very little, but by doing so, other than really just a political victory, and they stand to gain a lot. So U.S. military history says it was necessary that the militias and citizen population of the Revolutionary era had such weaponry to defend against Indian attacks. Yes, that was a very real phenomenon. There's a reason that the merciless Indian savages were mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. Furthermore, it was, again, logistics is the deciding factor more often than not in conflicts like that, where prior to the French and Indian War, the French were operating in those regions, and they ended up needing to be able to form a militia that was able to stand toe-to-toe with the French until British regulars could arrive en masse on the continent, which is 3 months away at a minimum. So, and there also was a different philosophy entirely, where the founding fathers were very, very afraid of a standing military for, I think, reasons we're coming to see right now, where all of a sudden the people are SOL if they ever wanted to actually do anything. Like they're up against incredible odds. Their idea was that, and they passed legislation to this effect too, as I've showed in a couple of my videos, where it was not only encouraged that you furnish yourself with military grade weaponry such that you could stand toe to toe with some sort of conventional military that might have designs on your territory. It was legislated. Every man was supposed to furnish himself with a firelock, as they called it, and 24 cartridges in a bag, and drill once a month, and that was the idea. And as the United States in particular got a little more domesticated, we thought things would be good forever. Speaking broadly in the context of the U.S. history, they were willing to acquiesce to some of the demands of the people who we would consider to be left-wing, that want to take away the ability of the private citizenry to own such weapons. So forget what we were talking about prior to my reading super chats here, but
well, I'm just sort of interviewing you. Do you have any questions about anything on my end? I mean, I can keep asking, because I'm curious about your military understanding of the world, again, which is something I don't have a lot of expertise in. I've always found the hardware to be fascinating, because from an engineering and sort of aesthetic point of view, I think it's kind of cool. But in terms of strategies and tactics, I just sort of look at it more broadly and kind of weave it together with political economics. I can keep going with my questions, but I don't know if you had anything for me, or if the audience has more stuff.
Well, I mean, just to sort of wrap up our discussion on, or at least our brief overview of sort of what you would be up against if you were to, try to be some sort of guerrilla force here in the United States, you're severely lacking in the requisite military equipment to continue on. AR-15s and other small arms are useful to a degree. Yes, you can absolutely wreak a lot of havoc, especially on power infrastructure with those small arms, but to what end, right? Like, if you were to take a look at social media when the power grid got hit, people were just pissed off that their lights didn't work, their heat didn't work in the middle of winter. You're just going to galvanize the public against you if you were to try and do something like that. Really, what you would need is, anti-tank weapons. You would need man-portable air defense launchers. You would need ammunition. You're not going to be able to readily supply yourself with it. You would need not just rifles, but automatic small arms if you were ever want to engage for more than about 45 seconds with any sort of, you know, U.S. military presence or NATO military presence. You would need indirect fire assets, like all these different things that you are literally unable to get your hands on here in the United States. And yeah, maybe if you were to prove yourself at some sort of Saratoga event, right? Like you, against all odds, really bloodied the nose of the force you were up against and somehow convinced a government like China or a government like Russia that arming you is not only worth the expense, but the risk of coming into conflict with the United States by supplying you with the things you need. I don't even know how they would get arms here in sufficient quantity to arm you.
Okay, can I give my read on this
Yeah,
while we're going into the sort of domestic operations stuff? First of all, I think it's a horrible idea. Okay, but let me explain why. So Jim is itemizing, I think, from a military strategy standpoint, the hardware that, first of all, nobody except the military has. And I think that's a correct analysis. Nobody who is serious about this would disagree with that. But if I could add, and to add on to your last point there, would we even benefit, or whoever, would anybody benefit by having a foreign power support them, if it's Russia or China at least? I think we've already established none of those countries like Americans. I don't think that's a good idea because of that. And then lastly, I'll add, and I think this is ultimately the more important one, without control of the culture and the media, at least, the broad public is not going to support any of this. They're going to see whatever somebody's doing domestically as an irritant at best and as a threat or terrorism at worst. And they're going to side up with the powers that be because the media tells them to, because their instincts and their practicality tells them that they can't get to work, they can't buy things at the store, their kids are getting bullets shot over their heads while they're going to school because of this stuff. They're not going to support it. And what happened in Ireland was very different because the people were more ethnically homogenous. They had a long history of not liking the British. I know people from Ireland. It's true. They don't like British people. That's not really generally true of Americans regarding whoever the enemy is supposed to be. Nobody really can define it that well anymore either. We're so diverse, basically. There's not really a unified force. And you go down the list. Hardware's not there. The network, I would say, is not going to be there if the internet gets shut off. The software is not going to be there because the culture doesn't support this type of thing. So I think it's a non-starter. And if I could add what I think people should focus on really is, you know, it's fine to learn about this stuff. That's information. I think knowledge is knowing how to use it, but I think wisdom is really ultimately the most important thing as to when is it applicable. And I think now is not the time. I think really all people who are dissatisfied with their government and their culture and the media and all the direction this country's gone in over the past X number of years is to teach their kids good values, to have kids, number one, but to teach them good values, to do right by them, to make them as strong as possible, to make your friends and family as strong as possible, to wait for the ultimate transformation of whatever the trend is going to take us to. We can't swim upstream. I mean, especially if we're minnows. We have to kind of go with the tide. It's like if anybody invests in the stock market, they say, look, you can't really fight the trends. You could sort of wait on the sidelines. That's one strategy. But because you sold the stock, but Warren Buffett bought it, I mean, the price is going to go up. If you can't compete against somebody who's 1,000 times wealthier than you, don't waste your money, because it really is just a waste. That's how I see things. And I look at it, obviously, from a more economic point of view, but I think it applies to anything. I was watching a documentary on the Normandy landings last night. maybe perhaps preparation for talking to a guy who has a more military background. But I've always found this stuff interesting, and it's sort of obviously it's a LARP for any of us to imagine that we're going to be Eisenhower or Rommel commanding vast armies in sort of a very unique point in history of the world, frankly. But be that as it may, it's still interesting stuff. And I think the lessons that you can draw from it are sort of applicable in a more practical sense, is that unless you've got the numbers on your side, and that's really what decided most of these wars, it's not worth wasting even going to battle. There was sort of uncertainty back then as to who really was sort of going to be dominant, and a lot of it was indicated by how the alliances were formed. I mean, this is sort of maybe a little off topic, but I mean, the Germans were, industrially speaking, able to go against the British. Okay, but if you throw in America and the Soviet Union against them, they're sort of at a 4-to-1 production disadvantage. And I look at it, from a manufacturing economic point of view, but that translates directly to a military thing as well. And both sides, uniquely in that time period, actually were dedicated to their own cause. So we don't even have that. But just looking at it from a hardware, strategic, logistics point of view, if you've got one soldier up against 4 soldiers, I mean, how the hell are you going to win? And we don't even have that going for us. We're probably 1 against 100. So I think it's ridiculous. So I think all we can do is really focus on the culture war, focus on the economics at the moment, and then maybe someday there might be a different analysis. But that's all I wanted to say.
Right, and you have to understand too that at this point in time, we are the dissidents, we are the subversive element, right? We no longer hold the institutions of power. And also recognize that the West has been subverted, and we got to this point without a shot being fired. And that's the true great military victory, is how do you win without firing a shot? Because even firing one singular bullet, you're wasting precious resources. That's an expenditure of resources, to say nothing of how destructive a war would be, or the tremendous loss of life that would follow. So there are paths to victory for a smaller, more subversive element to succeed. And part of that does start with immediately bettering yourself, right? Have kids, for God's sake, like fight the demographic change. That's a big thing. Also maintain your own health. Stop eating the goy slop, guys. Like maintain a healthy BMI, educate yourself, possess that knowledge. And again, not just knowledge, but wisdom as well, to Adam's point. But you also have to understand too that if you are sitting here waiting for a LARP event, the big igloo that's never going to come, all your rifle that you've invested all this money into serves as is a pressure release valve for you. It's cowed you into an action. And
it's frankly it's money that you could have put into something more productive. I've been doing a lot of financial analysis this winter, partly because I'm writing a book, but also partly because you need to do that sort of thing to manage your own finances and your families and everything. And one thing that really sticks out to me is the power of compounding, and we're all taught like what is compound interest. Hopefully we're all taught that in school. It's a pretty basic idea, but I think a lot of people forget about it because we go about our day and we're distracted by the demands of all the things we have to do and the people we have to talk to, and it's overwhelming. But if you actually take a step back over time, okay, the big separation between the companies, the governments, the economies, the people that really get out in front of other people or groups, what separates them is that they have a compounding strategy. And just to give you some numbers on this, and this is hypothetical, but I mean, there's plenty of examples of this, in life. And just look at again, the stock market, how companies who have returns of they're positive. Obviously, if you're losing money, you're not going to last too long. But if you take that money, right, and you put it into something like a rifle. I would say that's fine if you've got maybe a couple, all right? But what advantage are you going to have by having 10 rifles? I mean, you only got two hands. So take the rest of that money and put it into something that actually returns on your investment. And what this does is over time, it really makes a difference. So over 50 years, I was just running a little simulation here. If you start with $1 and one investment strategy gives you 1% return on that every year, and you reinvest your savings. So it's like, you just keep it in the bank or whatever. Every year you get 1% on whatever was left in the bank. So we're going to compound it now. After 50 years, you're going to have $1.64. Okay, that's something, right? Now let's say you get 5% a year. At the end of 50 years, you're going to have $11.46. Now compare that to the first scenario. Now, maybe it doesn't seem like a lot, like 1% versus 5%, but over time it actually adds up a lot. So you're going to have more than 5 times as much. Okay, now let's go to 10% a year. After 50 years, that's going to be $117. So now think about what your group, your family, your company, your economy, what lead are you going to have if you've made good choices now and applied them consistently over a long period of time over somebody else who didn't? You're going to have 100 times advantage over them if you do decide to actually go into a conflict where basically everybody loses. But if you've got the numerical superiority, you at least can knock out the other guy and you're not going to lose as much, at least proportionally. So I think we need to learn these lessons again if we've forgotten them, because I think you can waste a lot of time, which is frankly probably the most important thing in your life, and money on basically LARPing. I think a lot of our dissident movement, whatever it's called, needs to really take a hard look at the results of what all this stuff is, because it's one thing to like not know any of this stuff and then learn it. That's I think a decent return on some time. But to spend decades on repeating the same tired historical grievances, frankly, is what they are, to no effect, I think is a waste of time. And so with our show, I've tried to pivot us a little bit more towards, I think, what we can apply in our own lives, because frankly, the political avenues are closed to us. We can't apply it there. And I think the places we can apply it is, cultural stuff, make jokes. I mean, that's fine. And teach ourselves, stories and things like that. Inspire us, maybe make us better people, make our people better. I think that's fine. But to really think that by reading more books about some ancient war is going to really get us to seize the White House, I think is silly. I think really what we should probably be doing is trying to make as much money and make as much influence in our own lives over the things that we can influence. And I think if you compound it, again, over a long enough time period, you're going to have a huge advantage over those that really spun their wheels.
Well, and
we're seeing it's tough stuff, but you have to have patience and you have to have discipline to do this. And we all want that sort of quick, relatively speaking, quick victory, but I don't think it's going to happen. This is a long war.
No, and you have
especially if you're at a huge disadvantage to begin with.
Right, and again,
so
that's where I'm encouraging people to think like the guerrilla, think like the dissident. Stop thinking like you still have all these vestiges of power. You need to do what they did, and if you want to talk about, compounding interest and sort of in that vein of thought, one of the best things you can do is in anybody's day-to-day life, what has most effect on what they can and cannot do, how much money they have in their pocketbook, is really local politics, as much as we all like to pay attention to things going on the national stage. And really that's the lowest hanging fruit. I would encourage people who are of our same mindset to start looking towards how to start seizing smaller elements of these institutional power structures, run for school board, become an alderman, get into the state legislature, that sort of thing, where you can have some real effect some effect that might compound its way into much larger returns down the line. And
I think you're not wrong. I think before anybody does that, though, they have to obviously win. And I think the way you win an election like that is you have to actually be a somewhat successful person in your own private life. And I think
right,
typically that means you're a small business owner or you've been a manager. Obviously, you're a leader of some sort, right? And I think a lot of the things people look for in somebody like that is they have a family too. I mean, that takes leadership to do that. So all these little things that we may not articulate specifically when we're saying why we like one candidate over another, I think is implicit in why people make the decisions they do. And I think in order to win an election like that, I think you do have to have some accomplishments in your own private life. And even if that is required for that level, I mean, I think it sort of makes it obvious that, we're not going to become president of the country. And so, yes, start small, start getting some progress where you can. But I think even before you can get into local office, I think you do have to have a resume, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, that's frankly, like, obviously everybody can't be the president of the country. I think there is a process that does make sense that selects for the best in some way. It may require people to be very ruthless, perhaps, but I think it makes sense. It's meritocratic. You have to prove yourself, and it's not. None of this is easy. And knowing something is really not enough. You have to know when to apply it, how to apply it. You have to have social skills. All this stuff, I think, a lot of people on the internet dissident sphere just don't have, to begin with. And I think that's why a lot of us are frustrated. And those are legitimate frustrations. I mean, it's hard today. It's a little bit harder, I think, for certain things than our parents had it. It's easier in other ways, but it is what it is, and you just have to do your best. And I think what I don't like, if I could sort of ironically complain about what I don't like, is I don't like people who complain too much. I think it wastes time. It's good to identify problems, but you shouldn't really think that other people can fix your own problems. I think you have to be able to offer at least a suggestion to a problem that you might see. Otherwise, you're just you're bumming people out,
right,
Nobody wants to be around you. That's a social skill that people need to learn. And I know, and I've complained about this stuff too when I learned about it too, because it's overwhelming. It's like, wow, we've been lied to. But that's part of growing up, is that life isn't fair, realizing that, and wanting to do something about it is good. It's a good instinct. I think that's what makes a society somewhat healthy, is that people want to fix things that are wrong and unjust. But, when we're children, our parents care about us, hopefully. And when we complain, it actually usually helps because they love us, they're going to do something. But when we leave the house, the people around you don't love you. And complaining to them is actually counterproductive, unlike with your parents, perhaps, because all it does is marks you as somebody who's kind of got a negative attitude, doesn't really have any solutions, and is really just a source for problems, frankly. And nobody wants to be around that. You're not going to create a very successful team that way. I think that the best leaders are those that, one, can identify something that is maybe wrong, but very quickly, just like in sales, follows up with the solution. And that's what inspires people. You have to have the second part, frankly, more than the first part. And that's hard, especially when we don't have any real easy answers. But nobody said this was easy, right? So
right,
it is what it is.
right. Well, and to that end too, I mean, it's very easy to get depressed and despondent about the current state of affairs, but ultimately recognize that in a sense you've been given a gift that many generations don't have, where we've got a very clear purpose of we've got this litany of things that are wrong with society, and it is up to us to find a solution. And it does start with small things like, of course, getting your own personal house in order, ensuring you're financially secure. And even if your sole purpose in this life is to set your progeny up for success better than you were financially, so they can affect some change with that wealth. But
Yeah.
start looking for small, low-hanging fruit in terms of victories. I mean, again, not to shift, I sort of view things through the prism of war, because ultimately politics is, war. War is the continuation of policy by other means, by means of force. So,
Is that Clausewitz
yeah,
who said
that's
that?
Clausewitz. That's Clausewitz.
Yeah.
So, with that, I understand that everybody has, to some degree, that delusion of grandeur that they might participate in some sort of, gallant conflict, honorable fight, so to a degree, I think every little boy wants to fight a war without understanding truly what it is that war means. But understand that you're already fighting a war. Just because it hasn't gone kinetic doesn't mean that it's not a war, right? And we need to start, launching offensives on all fronts. And part of that does start with, again, getting your own financial house in order, but doing what you can to form parallel societies. I mean, if your contribution to our people is getting you and your family out of, the demographic hellhole that is an American city and out into the country, that's a win. That's a win for us. If your contribution is, not to make it seem like we're not having intelligent discourse here, but if your contribution is shit posting online, maybe you've converted one or two people who otherwise would not have been converted. That's a win. I think,
There's so much to do. It's actually very exciting if we can sort of take a step back, because taking awareness and turning it into a good thing for yourself and the people you care about is a gift. And think of it not as something that should alienate you from those that just don't get it, but think of it as like you have a special gift of knowledge, and it's up to you and your sort of duty to apply it well. And I want to give a couple practical things, if I may, just because I've been staring at the data over the past week plus, and this is part of a book that I'm working on. It's sort of a different strategy than the first book I wrote, which was actually called Exit Strategy, which is more of a litany of sort of analysis of what's wrong with American society and the American empire. And it touched upon a little bit of like, how do you sort of move away from that, going to that parallel concept. But the new work is really focused on hard-nosed, show me the numbers, show me the data, show me the evidence that this works and this does not work. And so it's just taking a lot of time, because to do that, it's hard. You actually have to have proof. So I'm trying to prove it. But one thing I'm working on right now is looking at what makes successful marriages. And I think, why do you care about that? I think, without having the numbers in front of me, I think we all intuitively agree that having an intact mother and father in the home is a leg up over a family that doesn't have that. And it's not to say that you can't be successful if you don't have those circumstances. None of that is the child's fault, obviously. But if you can, think about the next generation. You're going to want to pick a partner that is going to be with you for the long run, because evidence shows that the children of those people earn more money, are happier generally, and just good stuff. So you want to have a good marriage. So how do you have a good marriage? That's, I think, the harder question. As long as we can agree that having an intact family is good, how do you do that? Well, that's a hard question. Well, one thing I've been looking at is numbers from various data sets. Some of this comes from the United States. Some of this comes from other countries, which is fine. I mean, everybody has the same problem, no matter where they live. They want to have somebody that stays with them and has children, hopefully, that grow up to be successful. So this is coming from different places, but the patterns are pretty similar. It varies a little bit, obviously, where you are, but the patterns are kind of emerging. And so one of them that really jumps out to me is, in order to increase the length of your marriage or decrease the odds of divorce, there's a few things. One thing is, I would say, and this can be interpreted slightly differently depending on your biases, but similar levels of education and a decent amount of income is correlated with a successful non-divorce or a marriage. So if you have a college degree, you're probably going to want to marry somebody with a college degree. If you marry somebody who doesn't have a college degree, not to say that they're bad, but there's probably just going to be a cultural difference there that leads to a divorce, and the evidence shows that. So that's one thing. Another thing is having a good income helps a little bit. To what degree is also sort of making this more complex. I'll put this in the book with charts and stuff. But making sure you have enough money obviously decreases the chance of divorce, because financial difficulties are often cited as why people break up. One thing that obviously I would hope you would already know, but it comes out pretty clearly in the data, is anybody who has drug or alcohol problems is going to have a hard life, obviously, for themselves, but it's also going to cause family problems. That's going to be something that is negatively correlated with marriage or positively correlated with divorce. And that one comes out as the strongest negative impact on a successful marriage. So those little things, I think, are practical for, I think, everyone, hopefully. And I've looked at many things, and there's other things that people say, but maybe actually don't matter in the long run. I don't want to pick on anything in particular, and to not confuse things, just to reiterate, having a roughly similar educational background, having a good income, and not falling into drugs or alcohol, I would say, are the takeaways from my preliminary research. But I'm doing this for a lot of other things, like where do you go to school, what social activity should you engage in, things like that, provided that you want to be successful in life. So those are the types of projects I'm working on. It just takes a lot of time. And this research is sort of out there already. Not to say that people haven't focused on this, but I'm trying to consolidate it and apply it to our circumstances, which are really not addressed directly by the mainstream, obviously. I mean, we're sort of, who cares about disaffected white males in America, right? They're considered already so privileged that why would anybody want to care about that? And that's why Jordan Peterson, frankly, got his career going, was because he actually talked about that stuff. Now, does he talk about some of the other things we talk about? No. But I'm trying to make it a more quantitative version of maybe the 12 rules for life, which I have not read, full disclosure, but I think the gist of it is he basically gives you kind of advice like this. And I don't know if he bases it on data, though, which I think is ultimately what makes or breaks an investor in something like the stock market. It's one thing to say, you should buy value stocks and don't follow fads. Don't jump at Bitcoin at the top. Those are all true, but how do you actually identify the when? That's where I think where the numbers come in, and I think that's sort of missing out there. So, a couple of things thought I'd throw out as examples.
No, and that's actually really fascinating. I'd personally be interested in reading that when it's complete, and I'm sure my viewers would as well. I'm going
to try to publish some of this open source, because I think it's just, I feel kind of guilty by like trying to, basically what I did with the last book was, if you donate a penny to our show, you'll get the first book. I'll probably do something like that with this, like just donate to the show. Like I'm not trying to get rich off of this. I'm just trying to do something, and it takes a lot of time, so I'm trying to not sort of spin my own wheels in this.
Right, offset that initial investment.
Yeah. But I'm probably just going to publish a fair number of these things in articles on our website for writing, The American Sun, and it'll come out. I mean, I want this information out there, because I don't, frankly, at this point in my life, I don't have time for reading people's opinions. I want to know facts, and I want to know hard evidence.
Right.
It's fine to have an opinion, but you got to prove it to me. I'm getting too old for this.
Right.
So that's why I'm
Right.
doing this.
Yeah, your wife is definitely the most important financial decision you're ever going to make, and
Yeah.
also in that same vein as well, taking responsibility for your children's education, not just. And I understand that some people are in a situation where they literally cannot afford to do anything other than public school, but then you need to invest in your children insofar as education is concerned. Because again, going back to knowledge versus wisdom, yeah, they might learn a lot of book smart type things that will help them out for sure in life. Whether it be military strategy or economics or even just basic arithmetic, right? But all the knowledge in the world, if it's not tempered by a firm grasp on morality and how to properly apply that knowledge, is worthless. I've known some smart people that are absolute shit libs because they haven't had that proper moral education. And speaking personally, at least with respect to the school systems I've had personal experience with, and I think that this phenomenon is widespread, our children would probably be much better served homeschooled or in a private school. That's another thing to consider, and that's something that oftentimes will only be possible if you've got your financial house in order, like you said earlier.
So I did a little research on. That's one of the topics I'm going to focus on, education, and it's pretty overwhelming to remember all this. But now that you mention it, homeschooling is something I'm interested in also, and I do know people who have been homeschooled and who have thought about it or have kids. And I will say there is something to be said, just anecdotally from my own experience, for the fact that people who exclusively go through a homeschooling program do have a little bit of difficulty socializing. So I think it's important to complement that with some social outlets. So your kids got to know that people out there are not like their parents. I mean, one, but two, the incentives are different, and so they have to learn those social skills. But I would say from the data that I've found, actually the test scores of homeschooled children do okay compared to public or private education. They don't beat them, but you do need to give a little bit more attention to places like mathematics, because there is evidence to show that people who are homeschooled in that area don't do as well. So I would say if you're going to pursue that, you will either want to have one of the parents who's qualified to teach that to your children, put attention to it, put more time to it, or get a private tutor. Because that's one area where I think homeschooling does fall behind. Doesn't mean you can't fix it with a little bit more attention, but it's something to remember.
And the other piece of it too is, again, anecdotally, I don't. This isn't something I've heavily researched, so I'm operating off of my own experience with the matter. And if social aspects aside, right, because there are ways you can circumvent that by getting involved with certain homeschool organizations or taking your kids to church groups or this, that, and the other thing. You have to be able to find that fine balance of introducing your children to the immorality of the world. So by the time they're completed with their education and they come into contact, well, when they're no longer under your roof, when they're no longer under your control, they've already been exposed and inoculated to this sort of thing, rather than perhaps coming into contact with it for the first time, thinking that you lied to them and that is the way of the world because now their college professor says so.
I completely agree. I mean, I know a lot of Mormons, and one of the things about that community is that it's very insular. It's not as insular as the Amish, perhaps, but when those kids they kind of go out of the home, a lot of them do fall into drugs, partying, out of wedlock pregnancies, because they were sort of insulated, and they were not, frankly, they hadn't been exposed to the point where they can see the temptations of the modern world for what they are, which is very seductive, very entertaining, but very short-term benefits with long-term consequences. And you can get sucked into that really quickly if you have absolutely no bearings from your upbringing. It's very dangerous to not teach your kids about the bad things. I mean, and
Right.
also be realistic too, because I think kids are not idiots in that they they can see a lot on their own, and then if their parents tell them something that doesn't add up at all with their own perspective, that only lasts until they're a certain age, and then they can kind of start figuring things out. And so if you start trying to tell them something that doesn't align with what they're experiencing, they're just going to ignore you or give you lip service and basically make you think that they believe you. But you got to keep it real, for lack of a better phrase. I think in the long run, because it's just gonna shock your kid if they have no idea of what the hell the real world is like.
Right. They have to be introduced to the real world, and that's a fine line to walk. But are you familiar with Devin Stack, Black Pilled? You watched any of his stuff?
Yeah, your channel kind of reminds me a little bit of his approach. I used to watch a lot of his stuff. I haven't checked him out in a while, but he's done some good work. But yes, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was just going to say because he has talked about, on multiple occasions that same phenomenon that you were describing with the Mormon community in particular, because he was Mormon, where these people, as soon as they're out of sight of their parents, so to speak, just end up going off the deep end and getting to drugs. And he personally was involved with that. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, it's just a part of the real world. I mean, we could sort of fantasize about girls in wheat fields and going to church on Sunday and everything's happy, but it's not that simple. It's and I've been to churches and different types of churches, and I don't know. It's just a group of people. I mean, if it works for you and helps you, good, keep going. If it doesn't, find another church or do something else. That's how I look at most things.
right.
I don't hold too many things sacred if what they claim doesn't correspond to what actually happens.
And ultimately, too, church institutions are going to be reflective of the people that comprise them. Like you said, it's made up of people. So if you're,
Right.
especially if you're in an area where the society at large has gone off in one direction, you're going to see a church that reflects that. For instance, the Unitarians in particular come to mind, where they're pretty bad flying the gay pride flags, and do what thou wilt seems to be their modus operandi. Similarly, if again I know we've mentioned it tangentially, but if we sort of go through life trying to establish these parallel communities, ultimately those institutions are going to be reflective of that. And something like homeschooling or something like bouncing between different churches that don't seem to help may not necessarily be a thing we need to do.
Well, where do you want to take your channel over the next couple of years, if you intend to keep it up that long?
You know, um, the biggest piece of it to me is I couldn't sit idle and do nothing while I'm watching these people just straight up tell lies about history, about the West, and about white people in particular, because they're being used to justify some pretty heinous modern political actions. So um, I haven't found great success in attacking people directly, just because all that's going to succeed in doing is getting you brigaded. I think that um, the way I'm going to continue is sort of in the vein of the last couple of videos I've done, where I take a collection of things that are being said, right? I take that narrative, and without addressing it directly, in terms of who has been saying it, put together videos like my most recent one, particularly with what I think people need to hear. Uh, in particular, it's important to me, too, that people understand that violence is not our best option. It's not even our second best option. Like, sitting around and waiting for something that's never going to come is not going to, help us achieve our goals in the long run. So if I could be instrumental in converting people, and that's who my channel is oriented towards, people who might be nominally conservative but are sort of caught up in the oppression narrative pushed by the left, which is a large subset of the American right, I'd be pretty happy. there. I know it's only a matter of time before my channel gets the kibosh. I mean, as soon as I pick up any sort of steam on YouTube, I'm sure that they'll find a way to make me have violated terms of service. So, I mean, I'm just kind of I've got my own professional career where I'm fairly successful, and this is sort of what I'm doing as an outlet for me. I would love to,
Yeah.
I just like anybody who does this sort of thing, I'd love to make it big in that sense, or gain some traction and have my ideas put forward and really affect discourse on the dissident right. But I suppose I could ask you the same thing. I mean, I know you said there has been a distinct shift in your channel away from sort of the historical grievance to economics and positing solutions. So do you care to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, to support your efforts, I think it's good what you're doing. First of all, I would have a parallel platform if you don't already, just in case.
Yeah, all my stuff is
basically
backed up
everybody.
on Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble.
Yeah, there you
So
go.
don't get any views
Good,
there, so.
good. Yeah, I mean, I basically simul post on all the platforms, and I only
That's
do
what
it
you have to
because
do.
we're pushed into these ridiculous situations where in our own country we can't even talk. But no, I mean, to answer your question about us, we've slowed down partly because we're getting older. We've already done 240 some odd shows that has covered a lot of the stuff we wanted to cover when we set out to do this. And I don't feel like it's helping anybody to repeat stuff that is already out there, at least in our channel already. And I feel like we should focus on things that are adding value. And I think in the areas that we're adding more values, I think in a little bit more of the political economic stuff as opposed to just the pure political. That's my personal opinion. My co-hosts can speak for their opinion, obviously. And we're just getting older, and life is more responsibilities as you get older.
Right.
And so, but I want to keep it up. It's we want to keep it sustainable, and we are very grateful of all the opportunities we've had because of the show, because we've been able to talk to great people and learn a lot and hopefully become better people in the process. And I think that's a good thing to keep up as long as it makes sense. I do think it's going to be interesting if, I don't know, with Twitter sort of being reformed, what might happen there if free speech becomes a little bit more easier. I'm honestly not super holding my breath on any of that. I don't think it matters at this point that much one way or the other, but it is something to maybe be cautiously optimistic about.
Right.
I would not recommend anybody who wants to do this to use their real name.
Oh God.
I don't know if Jim
No,
is your real
that
name,
is
but I hope it
There's some
isn't.
poor bastard named Jim Dewey out there who is just
Okay.
getting reported to his HR department or something like that. No, but as we're sort of wrapping up the show, because I do try to keep these a watchable length of about 2 hours. I
Yep.
see Victor Saxon has again said, I know we've sort of moved away from the subject, but do you think that the reason Zog is so critical of gun rights and police forces is because they know they're the only tools we have to resist the oncoming demographic hordes? So I don't know if you have any opinion on that matter.
I think it's definitely one of the tools. I don't know if it's the biggest, but it certainly is obviously on their radar as something they would rather not have in the general population, making their exclusive franchise and violence non-exclusive. I mean, I think we all know what their motive is there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think they're terribly concerned about the guns in American hands, just because, like, in a large.
Yeah, we don't really do anything with them.
Right. If people were going to do something, they
First
would
of
have done it
all.
by now. I mean, nobody
Yeah, I
is.
think so.
You get these people who spend $10,000, on kit to go LARP in the woods,
Oh,
but they won't
waste of
ever
money.
saddle up
Ridiculous.
and go patrol the border or something like that. So they're not terribly concerned, especially because, again, like, yeah, a guerrilla could wreak real havoc on the infrastructure, but that really plays into their hands. Like becoming a terrorist, becoming a cartoon supervillain just plays into the narrative they want anyway. I mean, they might take some short-term
I mean,
losses,
I think a
but
lot of these events are manufactured for that very
no,
reason. I think
absolutely.
it's good propaganda for the powers that be. That look, you need to give us more power. You need to have us giving you more masks and vaccines because there's boogeymen out there, and we're the only experts and powerful, sophisticated enough people that can protect you. I mean, it's
Well,
the classic, rally around whatever
and
to
if
give the
9/11
people in
was
power more power.
if 9/11 was able to do what it did, right, which was sort of the catalyst for large-scale government surveillance, the Patriot Act comes to mind. Imagine what some sort of domestic and like actual insurrection in the United States would do. Imagine what legislation would get passed. The last time we had an out-and-out civil war, things as fundamental to the notion of democracy as habeas corpus were suspended. So, I mean, and again, they'll obviously push to take away any tool they can, because why allow you to have something that would be helpful to you, right? In the same way that they would try and push a guy like me who's got a limited number of ears to speak to off of the platform. Why even allow the chance for something to happen, right? And even in terms of self-defense or the oncoming demographic hordes, or however you want to refer to it, it's like I don't think it's entirely consequential to them whether or not you live or die in some sort of self-defense scenario, or whether or not you're able to resist the oncoming demographic hordes, because either way they win. And if they take your firearms away, ultimately the population at large is going to become more reliant and more used to being reliant on government power. And it's sort of like the frog in a slowly boiling pot of water. Like it's an incremental shift. They're going to take more, any liberty they can. So, but with that, I don't know if you have anything final to say before you wrap it up.
Well, I'll just reiterate a couple things, or one thing at least. You can't fight forces that are orders of magnitude more powerful than you and expect to win with any degree of high probability. So what I would say is, taking the last example of demographic changes from illegal immigration, for example, try to understand why that's happening. Some people think it's an ethnic hatred thing against the heritage Americans. I think there might be something to that. But to be honest, my personal read on it, the most likely reason that is allowed and encouraged, depending on whom you're looking at, is it benefits the powers that be. Why? One, it's obviously a voter base for the Democratic Party, obviously. Two, it is cheap labor for the Chamber of Commerce types. But three, and I think this is maybe forgotten sometimes, but I think it basically just increases GDP generally and raises pressure on real estate. And the people in power are generally wealthy. And what do they put most of their money into? It's property. And when you have more people fighting for the same amount of land, property values are going to go up. How are you going to fight that? There's trillions of dollars on the line. That's going to continue, as far as I could tell. So you can try to fight it, but I don't think it's worth your time. I don't like it. Okay, it has nothing to do with my preference, but it's just a fact. And whether we're going to like it or not is really irrelevant to whether it's going to continue, unfortunately, because we're just not in the position to change it. So I would just say, be realistic about what you think you can achieve with this knowledge we have. Again, and I think that's a good example
Right.
of why it's hard and to keep it real.
And with what you said, I couldn't have articulated it better myself, but it's also important to note that, the heritage Americans, the founding stock, people like probably most of us listening here right now, our heritage is rebellion. Inherently, there's something genetic, and I'm sure it could be traced down to individual, genomes, that is more resistant to authoritarian control, like they're trying to achieve here in the United States. So if you're importing a population set that's a little more docile, a little more willing to a little more used to the jackboot of a strong government on their neck, it's obviously beneficial to the powers that be to have that population set instead of you be their subject, especially when you can talk about a disparity in IQ all you want. Ultimately, technological advancement is sort of making that less of a factor in terms of things that are going to directly affect the elites, such as growth of GDP and production of vital foodstuffs and things of that nature. So, but with that, I suppose we'll wrap it up here. I truly appreciate you joining me here, Adam, and I appreciate all you guys who tuned in today. Again, links to all of Adam Smith's stuff and his channel, as you know, his larger channel as well, is in the description. Consider donating to him on Patreon, even if it's just or wherever. Is it Substack now? I think your Patreon got nixed.
No, we're on the crypto blockchain exclusively now. We have Bitcoin, Ethereum. I mean, look, if you don't have it, don't worry about it. It's all down anyway. But it's just a safer way to transact, I think, going forward. I mean, if I can give a quick plug, I think cryptocurrency is a good thing for humanity. I think it's one thing that maybe corrupt governments might not be able to completely destroy. They certainly can try, but it's one of the better innovations I've seen in the past 10 years.
Right, especially with how quasi payment processors like PayPal have been getting. So, with that, I think we'll end it